The scream didn't come from the boy lying on the wet cobblestones, it tore from Elias's own throat, a jagged, raw sound that was instantly swallowed by the roar of the thunderstorm. His spine arched violently, muscles seizing as if struck by lightning, while the shattered tibia of the child before him knitted itself back together with a wet, sickening crunch. In seconds, the boy's leg was whole, the skin smooth and unblemished. In the same breath, Elias's own left leg buckled. A spiderweb of agony shattered through his shin, turning the bone to dust within his own flesh. He collapsed into the mud, the freezing rain mixing with the hot sweat pouring down his face, gasping for air that tasted like copper and ozone. The crowd that had gathered didn't rush to help the man writhing in the dirt. Instead, they cheered for the boy, who scrambled up, laughing, testing his weight on a leg that should have been broken for months. The mother snatched her child away, muttering a quick, obligatory blessing toward the heap of rags that was Elias, before disappearing into the fog. They always left quickly, they couldn't bear to look at the cost. They wanted the miracle, but they despised the altar it was performed on. Elias lay there for a long time, the rain soaking through his threadbare coat, shivering not from the cold, but from the shock of the trauma he had just absorbed. This was his life in the precipice city of Ultimatum, a grim industrial sprawl clinging to the edge of a black ocean cliffs. He was a sin eater, though he ate no sins. He devoured pain. He swallowed injury. It was a gift he had been born with, a cruel biological circuit that allowed him to siphon the physical suffering of another living being into his own body. He didn't just feel it, he became it. If he took a cut to a burn, his skin blistered. The only mercy was that his body healed 10 times faster than a normal man's, but the pain was always real, and it always stayed just long enough to break his spirit. Dragging himself upright using a rusted lamppost, Elias limped toward his small, dilapidated clinic at the end of the alley. His leg was already knitting, the unnatural heat of his metabolism burning through the break, but every step was a fresh torture. The city of Ultimatum was a place of gray stone and black iron, where the sun seemed to be a rumor from a distant past. The air always smelled of burning coal and salt spray. It was a hard place for hard people, and in a city where workplace injuries in the great foundries were common, Elias was more valuable than gold. And yet, he was poorer than the rats that scurried in the gutters. He pushed open the heavy oak door of his sanctuary, the bell above it giving a dull, cracked chime. Inside, it smelled of antiseptic, dried herbs, and the metallic tang of old blood. He didn't even have time to remove his soaked coat before a knocking came at the door. It wasn't the tentative knock of the poor, it begging for salvation. It was the heavy, rhythmic pounding of a cane. Elias slumped into his chair, gripping the armrests until his knuckles turned white. "Enter," he croaked, his voice raspy from the scream he had unleashed earlier. The door swung open and a tall, gaunt man stepped in. He was dressed in velvet and silk, materials that seemed alien in this part of the city. Lord Valerius, the owner of the ironworks, the man who effectively owned Ultimatum. He looked immaculate, save for a gloved hand he held protectively against his chest. His face, usually sharp and imperious, was pale, beads of perspiration standing out on his forehead despite the chill. "Elias," Valerius said, the name sounding less like a greeting and more like a diagnosis. "I require your services." Elias looked up, his eyes sunken and rimmed with red. He was only 30 years old, but he looked 50. His hair was streaked with premature gray, and his hands were a roadmap of white scars, burns, slices, punctures, a history book of other people's accidents. "I am closed, my lord. The bull leg, I need rest, my body needs to catch up." Valerius stepped closer, the tip of his silver-headed cane clicking sharply on the floorboards. "Pain does not wait for convenience, healer. And neither do I." He began to unbutton his shirt with a trembling hand. "I have visited the best doctors in the capital. They offer me opium and pity. They say it is a rot that starts in the marrow and eats outward. They give me a week." He pulled the shirt aside. Elias recoiled. On Valerius's chest, just above the heart, was a patch of blackened, necrotic flesh the size of a fist. It pulsed with a sickly, dark rhythm, veins of purple poison branching out from it like roots of a dead tree. The smell hit Elias instantly. Sweet, rotting meat. It was death. Pure, concentrated decay. "I cannot take that," Elias whispered, fear piercing through his exhaustion. "That isn't a broken bone or a fever, Valerius. That is necrotic. If I take that, my heart will stop before I can heal it. It will kill me." "It might kill you," Valerius corrected, his eyes gleaming with a desperate, terrifying intensity. "But you are special. You survive what others cannot, and I am prepared to compensate you. Not with the copper coins the rabble throws at your feet. I am talking about freedom, Elias, real freedom. Valerius reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch, dropping it onto the table. It landed with a dense thud that shook the glass jars on the shelves. Gold. Enough to buy a ship, enough to leave Oak Haven. Enough to go to the Sunlands where you will never have to touch a sick person again. You can stop being the city's garbage disposal. Elias stared at the pouch. He looked at his own trembling hands. The temptation was a physical blow, to leave, to feel the sun, to own his own body again. For 10 years, he had been a slave to his own empathy. He couldn't walk down the street without flinching when someone coughed. He felt the phantom pains of strangers. He had given pieces of his soul to heal the broken, and what did he have? A leaking roof, a body full of scars, and a loneliness so deep it echoed. But his was suicide. I can't, Elias said, his voice shaking. It's too much cost. Valerius's face twisted into a snarl. The facade of the nobleman dropped, revealing the terrified animal underneath. You will do it. What is your life worth truly? Look at you. You are a husk. You live to suffer. If you die saving me, you die a hero. If you refuse and I die, do you think my sons will look kindly on the man who let their father rot? I can shut down this clinic. I can ensure that no one in this city sells you so much as a loaf of bread. The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. But it wasn't the threat that broke Elias, it was the truth in Valerius's words. You are a husk. Elias looked around his room. The empty chair where no friends sat, the cold stove. The bed he barely slept in because the nightmares of other people's pain kept him awake. He realized with a sinking horror that he didn't value his own life. He had spent so long treating himself as a vessel for others that he had forgotten he was supposed to be the captain of the ship. He was just the hull, taking the battering of the waves. If I do this, Elias said quietly, and I die, you must swear to give the gold to the orphanage on Baker Street. Every coin. Valerius's eyes lit up, the desperation replaced by predatory triumph. You have my word as a gentleman. But you won't die, Elias. You are too stubborn for that. Elias stood up. His legs screamed in protest, but he ignored it. He walked over to the nobleman. The smell of the rot was overwhelming now, making his eyes water. He could feel the dark energy radiating from the wound, a cold void hungry for warmth. Prepare yourself, Elias murmured. He raised his hand. His fingers trembled. He knew the mechanics of what was about to happen. He would touch the black flesh. The connection would open. The rot would flow like a river of sludge into his own chest. His heart would falter. His blood would thicken. He would have to fight every second to keep shutting down while his metabolism tried to wage a war against death itself. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of rain and despair one last time. For the children, he whispered to himself, a lie to make the suicide palatable. He slammed his hand onto Valerius's chest. The world didn't go black, it went white. A pain unlike anything Elias had ever known exploded in his center. It wasn't the sharp snap of a bone or the sear of a burn. It was a freezing, grinding disintegration. It felt as if a hand made of ice had reached into his ribcage and crushed his heart into powder. He heard Valerius gasp, a sound of immense relief, as the color flooded back into the nobleman's cheeks. But Elias couldn't breathe. He fell backward, crashing into his instrument table. Glass shattered. The floor rushed up to meet him. He clawed at his own chest, tearing his shirt open. The skin there was turning black before his eyes, a spreading ink stain of death moving with terrifying speed. His vision tunneled. The room spun. He could see Valerius buttoning his shirt, looking down at him not with gratitude, but with mild curiosity, like a scientist watching a rat in a maze. Remarkable. Valerius muttered, his voice sounding miles away. Simply remarkable. Elias tried to speak, to call for help, to demand the gold, but only a gurgle of dark blood escaped his lips. The cold was spreading to his limbs now. He couldn't feel his legs. The darkness of the room began to close in, shrinking his world down to the size of a pinprick. He was alone. He was dying. And the man he had saved was simply watching him fade, already checking his pocket watch. As the last flicker of light vanished, Elias had one final, devastating thought. He isn't going to pay. He never intended to pay. Then, there was nothing but the cold. The void was not silent. It was a cacophony of whispers. Elias floated in a space between heartbeats, suspended in a gelatinous darkness that pressed against his eardrums. He heard the cries of the boy with the broken leg, the weeping of the widows he had consoled, the groans of the foundry workers. For years he had swallowed their agony, believing it was his duty. He believed he was a filter, designed to catch the impurities of the world so others could drink clean water. But in the dark, a new voice emerged. It wasn't a whisper. It was a roar. It was his own voice. Why, it screamed. Why must you burn so they can stay warm? The cold that Valerius had forced into him wasn't just necrosis, It was a profound, icy selfishness. It was the essence of a man who believed the world existed to serve him. And as that freezing entity tried to snuff out Elias's soul, it encountered something unexpected. It didn't find a martyr. It found a survivor. Deep within Elias's marrow, the biological furnace that had healed 1,000 broken bones roared to life. It was fueled not by empathy this time, but by rage. Pure, white-hot indignation. He had been used, he had been discarded. And he was not done. Elias gasped, his eyes snapping open. The air in the clinic was freezing. He was lying on the floor amidst the shards of the instrument jar. His chest felt heavy, like a stone was resting on his ribs. He clawed at his shirt, tearing the fabric further. The black patch was there, but it had stopped spreading. It was no longer a wet, pulsing rot. It was a scar, a hard, jagged knot of obsidian flesh fused to his skin. The poison had been metabolized. He had eaten the death, digested it, and it had left a mark that would never fade. He rolled onto his side, coughing up a thick, black bile that sizzled when it hit the wood floor. He wiped his mouth with the back of a trembling hand and looked at the table. The leather pouch was gone. Valerius hadn't just left him to die, he had taken the gold back. The realization hit Elias with more force than the necrosis. It wasn't just theft, it was a declaration that Elias's life had zero value. To the Lord of Oakhaven, the Sin Eater was nothing more than a disposable bandage. Elias stood up, his legs shook, but they held. He grabbed his coat. He didn't bother with his cane, he didn't need it. The pain was still there, a dull thrumming in his chest, but it was no longer a burden. It was fuel. He walked out into the storm. The rain had turned into a deluge, flooding the gutters of Oakhaven, turning the streets into rivers of filth. Elias walked with a purpose he had never possessed before. People huddled in doorways saw him pass, a shadow cutting through the rain, and shrank back. There was something different about the healer tonight. The softness was gone from his eyes, replaced by the hard, flat look of a predator. He reached the iron gates of the Var's estate. The guards, seeing the man who had supposedly saved their master, hesitated. "Let me pass," Elias said. His voice was low, vibrating with a terrifying resonance. It wasn't a request. The guards exchanged a glance, unnerved by the intensity radiating from him, and stepped aside. They knew better than to stand in the way of a man who looked like he had just climbed out of a grave. Elias pushed open the heavy double doors of the manor. The warmth inside was oppressive, smelling of roasted meats, expensive wine, and wood smoke. He followed the sound of laughter to the great dining hall. Lord Valerius sat at the head of a long mahogany table, surrounded by a dozen sycophants and minor nobles. He was flushed with wine, his shirt open to reveal a chest that was pink and healthy, completely free of the rot that had nearly killed him hours ago. He was recounting the story, gesturing wildly with a goblet in his hand. "And the fool simply took it, absorbed it like a sponge. I told him he would be a hero." Valerius laughed, the sound wet and ugly. "I didn't tell him he'd be a dead hero. But really, it saves me the trouble of paying him. A clean ledger is a happy ledger, don't you agree?" The guests roared with laughter. "Is that so?" The laughter died instantly. Heads snapped toward the arched doorway. Elias stood there, dripping wet, mud pooling around his boots. He looked like a specter, his face pale, his eyes burning with a dark fire. The scar on his chest seemed to pulse beneath his wet shirt. Valerius dropped his goblet. Red wine spilled across the white tablecloth like blood. "You," he stammered, the color draining from his face. "You're dead. I saw the light go out of your eyes." "The light went out," Elias said, taking a slow step forward. But the fire remained. He walked toward the head of the table. The guests scrambled away, overturning chairs in their haste to distance themselves from the walking corpse. Valerius tried to stand, but his legs betrayed him, and he slumped back into his chair, clutching his silver-headed cane like a weapon. "Stay back," Valerius shrieked. "Guards, guards, they aren't coming," Elias said calmly, stopping just a foot from the Lord. "You promised me a price, Valerius." "Freedom, gold, a new life." Valerius fumbled at his belt, producing the leather pouch he had stolen back. He threw it onto the table. Take it and go, you monster!" Elias looked at the Valerius. He reached out and picked up the heavy bag of gold. He weighed it in his hand, feeling the density of the coins. "This buys a ship," Elias said softly. "This the future." "Yes, just leave," Valerius cried. Elias placed the bag gently back on the table. "But it doesn't buy a cure." Valerius blinked, confused. "What, you cured me? I am clean." "Took the rot from your fly," said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the silent room. "I absorbed the necrosis, but Valerius, the rot wasn't a disease. It was a manifestation. It was your cruelty, your poison, forcing its way out of your soul and onto your skin. Elias placed his hand over his own heart, over the black scar. I am a sin eater. I eat pain, but pain isn't disappear, it just moves. He reached out. Valerius recoiled, pressing himself against the back of his chair. No. Don't touch me. Elias didn't touch him. He simply hovered in inches from Valerius's chest. I'm not gonna hurt you, my lord. I am simply going to give you a choice. I can keep this burden. I can carry your death for you. But the price has changed, Elias sobbed. Double the gold. Triple. I don't want your gold, Elias said. I want your legacy. He pointed to the window, toward the smokestacks of the foundry that loomed over the city. You will sign the deed to the orphanage. You will establish a fund for the widows of the men who died in your factories. You will sign over the ownership of the clinic to the city, fully funded, in perpetuity. You will do it tonight? Or, Elias closed his eyes and exhaled. The air around them grew cold. The scar on Elias's chest glowed with a faint, sickly purple light. Simultaneously Valerius screamed. He clutched his chest. Beneath his silk shirt, a black spot began to bloom, spreading like ink in water. I can give it back, Elias said simply. The connection is not broken, it is merely stretched. Refuse, and I release the tether. The rot returns to us ripped his shirt open. The black veins were racing across his skin, the smell of decay instantly filling the room. Stop! Stop it! I'll do it! I swear! Elias held his gaze, his face like stone. He waited, he let the pain linger for 10 agonizing seconds, let Valerius feel the cold breath of the grave one more time. Right, Elias commanded. Paper was brought, quills were broken in haste. Trembling signatures were made. Witnesses were forced to sign at gunpoint of Elias's glare. When the last document was sealed, Elias exhaled. He mentally clamped down on the connection, pulling the rot back into himself. It was agony, a fresh wave of nausea and fire, but he bore it. He locked it away in the scar. Valerius slumped forward sobbing, checking his chest. The blackness had receded, leaving only pale, terrified skin. Elias gathered the documents. He picked up the bag of gold. You said you didn't want the gold. Valerius whispered. Broken, I don't, Elias said. The orphanage needs a new roof. Elias turned and walked out of the great hall. He didn't look back at the shivering nobleman. He walked out of the manor, past the terrified guards, and back into the rain. The pain in his chest was permanent now. It would hurt every day for the rest of his life. He would never be fully whole again. But as he walked through the streets of Oakhaven, Elias realized something profound. He had spent his life thinking that kindness meant being a doormat. He thought that to be here he had to be a victim. He was wrong. True compassion wasn't soft. It was fierce. It was demanding. It required the strength to not only heal the broken, but to stand up to the breakers. He stopped at the edge of the cliff, looking out over the dark, churning ocean. The rain washed the mud from his face. He wasn't just a sin eater anymore. He was something new, something balanced. He was a man who knew the cost of life, and for the first time, he was willing to make sure the right people paid the bill. The storm raged on, but inside Elias there was finally silence. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Daily Motivation Tales for more tales of transformation and redemption.